TopMedTalk.
I'm delighted to welcome Ken van Sommeren, who I first met a couple of years ago, and I was blown away by the talk that he did. Ken has a wealth of experience in human performance and exercise science. And just to give you some context around that, he was a director of human performance for the British team for the London 2012 Olympics. Moving on from there, Ken started to work with GSK and was the director of their human performance laboratory, and I'm sure had many notable people under his care during that time. And he now has branched out and is running his own health and well-being in the workplace piece. So you might tell us a bit about that, I don't know. But anyway, I would like to give a warm welcome, please, to Ken van Sommeren.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for the introduction and the invitation to come and speak. And thank you all for attending. You could still be out there eating your puddings or talking, so thank you very much for coming in. As Jerry described, really my background is a longish career in elite sport. I've done that based in academia for a while. I then moved into a publicly funded organisation looking after elite performance, as Jerry mentioned, for a good number of years leading up to the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Thereafter in industry, and more recently running my own consultancy business. But really the whole way through that time, yes, it's been about elite performance, but not just in athletes. Always looking at the opportunity to translate to the broader populations. And some of you may well be thinking, why on earth would GSK employ a sports scientist and set up a human performance innovation centre? And it was in part to support the sports nutrition brands, but also in part to look at how we can translate those insights and really what we learn from people at this end of the spectrum of health and performance that can come back to the consumer group and potentially translate over to pharma and the patient group. So I feel very privileged to be able to speak to you today. Obviously, I'm not an expert in your world. Our worlds are incredibly different, the worlds that we work in and the sort of people that we work with. But I think there's some very common themes and challenges here. Not least the elite athlete and the patient are facing an incredible challenge, and a challenge that matters greatly. It may well not be a matter of life or death to the athlete, but sometimes it feels like it. Without doubt, preparation improves the probability of success. And that's one of the things that I'll focus on in my talk today. And I think perhaps the third common theme is the athletes and the patient are surrounded by multidisciplinary teams. Experts from different disciplines, and we've heard about many of those this morning, and I'm sure you did yesterday as well. And a focus of my talk will also be how can we bring those people together, very effectively harness the collective expertise that they have. And that's not always easy to do. So what I would like to do is offer some insights and perspectives from elite sport that I hope will be coming from a different perspective, address some common themes that you guys face on a day-to-day basis as well. And when you're thinking about how we can develop this whole area of perioperative medicine, I'm sure some of the challenges will resonate, and you'll be thinking there may well be something, I hope there may well be something in here that you can take away to do so. So this is quite a nice illustration of elite sport. This is the photo finish of the women's triathlon at the London 2012 Olympics. So after 1 hour, 59 minutes and 48 seconds of racing, it came down to that. And the Swiss athlete on the far side beat the Swedish athlete on this side by that margin, which is fairly tight after 2 hours of racing. So clearly in this world, every difference matters. And I think that's probably true to your world as well. You're looking at a number of different interventions, modifiable behaviours and risk factors that you can make that change. So the first perspective or the insight I'd like to share with you is understanding what it takes to win. I spoke a moment ago about athletes and patients facing a huge challenge. And for this individual, Bradley Wiggins, this is a photo of him doing his 1 hour world record attempts, which he won a few years back now. Understanding the demands of the event is actually relatively straightforward. It's cycling in a circle for as long as you can for an hour. Now, you know what the world record is, so he knows what speed he needs to go. He knows how much he weighs. He knows the aerodynamics of that position, so he knows how much power output he has to produce. And this can all be modelled to the nth degree. And we can start tweaking some of the details around the aerodynamics, for example. The design of the helmet, the skin suit, these things don't happen by chance. These are very, very carefully engineered to give those slight differences. And of course, every time we change one input into the system, we've got to recalculate, remodel to understand what some of those other factors now look like. And that allows us to provide very, very targeted preparation. So for Bradley cycling around the track for an hour, his key challenges were maintaining sufficient power output, pacing, thermoregulation, because build-up of body heat is going to be impediment to performance and muscular contraction here, and indeed a host of psychological factors as well. It's a hideous event. It's one of the hardest events you can possibly do. So, to put this into context, staying with cycling as a sport, but as a slightly more open example, something called the Race Across America. When I was at GSK, our team looked after Sue Pillinger, who you can see photographed there. And she was aiming to and became the winner of the women's event that year, so women's solo. So this is a 3,000-mile race from the west coast of the US to the east coast. You are supported, so there's a support vehicle behind you, and there's a cut-off point for women of 12 days. So if you haven't completed 3,000 miles in 12 days, you're out. She also had a pretty good idea what her competitors were capable of doing from previous years. But what we didn't know was how much sleep she would need and how far she would be able to cycle and what we would have to do to be able to fuel that. So what we did here was actually, the illustration here is all about measuring substrate utilization. So at a given intensity that we thought she was going to have to maintain for 20 hours a day, so she had about 4 hours off the bike every 24-hour period to sleep, ablute, everything else that needs to be done, the pace she would have to go. And in the laboratory, we could measure fat oxidation, carbohydrate oxidation. And based on that, we could calculate how much she would have to feed during that 20-hour and 24-hour period. And we could get that absolutely right. In terms of sleep, the first year she did this, she was going really well, fell asleep on the bike, not for the first time, cycled into the curb, went over the handlebars, broke her collarbone. But that gave us some brilliant data from monitoring her sleep. And what we worked out for the year she was successful, rather than try and sleep for a massive 3 hours a night, we broke it down into 2 stints of 90 minutes through the day. And what we found is actually she could achieve better or higher quality and more deep sleep by doing that. And she managed to stay awake. So what it takes to win, understanding the demands of the event. Marginal gains. Now, some of you may well have heard of this term of marginal gains within sport. And Sir David Brailsford, who was team director of the British cycling team, now team director of Team Ineos, formerly Team Sky, professional road cycling team, he speaks about the aggregation of marginal gains, which is if we understand what it takes to win, we break down performance into every single component part, we improve every single component part, we get a marginal gain, we put it all back together, and we see a significant gain. It's not always quite that simple. It doesn't always work in that way. And the important thing to also realise is that marginal gains isn't just about aerodynamic helmets or incredibly expensive bikes. It's about a whole host of other things. It's about nailing the basics and doing that incredibly well. Another anecdote from cycling. During the London 2012 Olympics, there was a bit of media attention because Dave Brailsford, head of Team GB, said, "We're going so well because we have rounder wheels than the competition." And people started panicking and the competition started saying, "How can they have rounder wheels? What's this all about?" And quite simply, over the years and over a number of Olympic cycles, Team GB has worked with engineers and scientists and medics to get the very, very best equipment and the very best preparation. So those wheels that cost an absolute fortune, we know give that fraction of a second per lap going at a certain speed. We use them at the Olympics, then we put them away in the cupboard until the next Olympics. And we know when we're modelling performance at World Cup events and World Championships and training, that when that kit comes out, this time translates into that time. So there's a psychological advantage there as well. There's also something really important here, which I'll touch on very briefly, around the placebo or the belief effect. And athletes and coaches, as you can probably imagine, are notorious for latching on to gimmicks, snake oil, call it what you want. But of course, we look at the scientific literature around the placebo effects and the belief effect, it is incredibly potent. If I had spent my career talking to athletes and coaches saying, well, doing this might help, but it might not, I'd be out of a job. And there'd be certainly be no performance impact. So how can we, and I'll come on to this in a moment as well, how can we use that belief effect to genuine advantage? Okay, I spoke there about getting the basics right. On the left-hand side, general adaptation syndrome, as a concept, yeah, we all understand it. In our world, a bout of training, we see fatigue, we see a recovery phase, we see the adaptation, which is why we train. Unfortunately, we've got to keep training, otherwise we get that detraining effect. But these axes don't have units. This is an inexact science. And the only way we get that right is by incredible coach experience and expertise, and the individual athletes understanding their body and understanding what they're doing. So it is a challenge, but if we don't get that right, then rounder wheels are going to have absolutely no effect. And on the right, you can see an infographic just looking at the likelihood or the incidence of injury in athletes who sleep 8 or less hours. And this is probably no surprise to anyone. And what we see is a significant increase in the risk and the incidence of injury amongst athletes when sleep decreases from 9 to 8 hours and beyond. Interestingly, when you drop from 6 to 5 hours, your risk of injury goes down slightly. I'm not advocating that. That is because the athletes are probably so exhausted by the time they get to training, intensity of the training is right down, or that they haven't completed the training. So please don't interpret that as 5 hours is better than 8 hours. And then some really interesting work that the English Institute of Sport have done, looking at illness surveillance. We know that over the last 2 years, there have been 630 respiratory illnesses in 402 of our athletes. There's about 1,300 or 1,400 world-class programme lottery-funded athletes in the UK. So a significant portion of those got respiratory illnesses. Each illness resulted in 9 days of restricted training. That could be missed training, it could be reduced intensity or duration. As a total burden to the system, that's over 5,500 days of compromised training. And if you're sitting at government level, DCMS level, UK sport, or indeed the national governing body, yes, what your individual athlete is doing is important, but you look at that as a system burden, we can't afford that. That is a huge loss of efficiency and resource. 85% of these were upper respiratory tract infections, and what was seen was a spike in the incidence during December and January. This may in part be the weather, it may in part be the prevalence of the common cold. It's also, we think, because athletes stop training, they go home and meet friends and relatives who aren't particularly healthy. They've probably been burning the candle at both ends, they're drinking too much and all the rest of it, and they expose themselves to infection. And so we get this massive spike. So we're missing an image there, but the image was a little gift pack that the Institute of Sport gave every athlete in early to mid-December last year. And as well as some educational leaflets, there was a hand foam sanitizer and a mouth spray. And they were given to every athlete on the programme. And what we saw over that December-January period was a 45% decrease in that burden. Now, it's not an RCT. I know that, we know that, but it's pretty compelling practice-based evidence. Now, there could be a whole host of other factors, but that in itself is telling us for pretty limited resource and effort, that's something we should do again next year, and we should be looking at other interventions as well. Okay, the next one, integrated solutions. As I mentioned earlier, we in sports science and sports medicine bring together these disciplines. So part of my role leading up to London 2012 was looking after the different sciences. So that's strength and conditioning, it's physiology, biomechanics, nutrition, psychology, etc., etc. And we work very closely with physiotherapists, sports physicians, and of course the coaches. And what I think sport does pretty well is using multidisciplinary teams to take interdisciplinary approaches. We haven't always been very good at that, and sometimes even on a bad day now, we still have the physiologists arguing with the nutritionists and trying to shout louder. If you're an athlete or a coach, you don't give a damn what someone's profession is. It may well be the same for your patients. All they want to know is, in our world, will it make the boat go faster? Is it going to enhance my recovery? Is it going to enhance my chance of survival? Whatever the question might be. I think a really nice example in sports, and these might not be the most elite athletes in the world, but the pit crew in Formula One. And this is a really, really interesting team because without doubt, there's a very clear common purpose and objective there. They've got to do what they need to do to the car during the pit stop and get it out as quickly as possible. Every person has a different role within that team. They all know exactly what their role is. Now, these guys by day sit in workshops taking apart cars and engines and putting them back together. On race day, they're expected to perform like an elite team. And we look at the choreography, we look at the synchronization of those movements, we look at who's doing what, we look at cognitive skills, so visual eye tracking, because whoever's changing the wheels needs to be visually tracking the wheel coming in so you can get the gun on as quickly as possible. 100th of a second changed could be the difference when it comes to results of that F1 race. I think we have a bit of a luxury in elite sport, not least in the UK, because we are pretty well resourced. We also have incredibly low numbers of people that we have to deal with. That gives us an opportunity, but it is also a challenge. And the first point here is around outliers, not averages. And when it comes to evidence-based practice, which is something sports science and sports medicine has had a bit of a struggle with over the last couple of decades, where do you look for your evidence? Most of the evidence in sports science particularly, so should we supplement with creatine in the diet? Should we do this type of training? Generally tends to come out of universities, and participants tend to be undergraduate students. Now, any of you that can remember your university days, it's probably fair to say undergraduate students aren't particularly like elite athletes. So we end up looking at people who maybe train 3 times a day. And does this intervention work? It doesn't give us an awful lot of confidence when we're going to a cohort who train 15, 16 times a week. So we're in the business of looking at outliers rather than averages. And because of that, and I've mentioned this previously as well, practice-based evidence, we have to develop our own evidence as we go, which is, I know, something that you're doing as well. So insights like the 45% reduction in burden. Now, if that was to be GSK rolling out and telling the world and the regulatory authorities that this decreases the incidence and duration of colds by 45%, we'd be hammered because GSK are trying to make profit from it. But when you're in a not-for-profit organisation and you are simply trying to deliver impact, you have to create evidence where you can, and you need to apply that evidence base where you can. So to give you an example here, this again was some work we did at GSK, but English Institute of Sport and other national governing bodies do it as well. And this is preparing for the environment of the Rio Olympics and Paralympics 3 years ago. The UK, unfortunately, isn't particularly hot, so whenever we travel to places like Rio, we have to prepare for the worst. So on the right-hand side there, you can see the environmental chamber. We put the temperature to 35 degrees Celsius, and we increased humidity to 65%. So pretty uncomfortable. And we did that to see how the athletes respond to that sort of thermal load, but also to develop personalised strategies for them. Now, in the event, Rio was nowhere near that hot or humid, but it could have been. So we were preparing them. And I love this, the mantra that you've got here, fit to fight. That's exactly what we're trying to do with athletes. We're preparing them to give them the best chance of success. And so one of the things we did here was look at sweat rate and sweat composition. Everyone sweats a different amount. And so these are the, 9 members of the British triathlon team. And we replicated the triathlon competition there in the environmental chamber. And we looked at sweat rate. And as you can see, and you may not be surprised, sweat rate varies significantly from around 1 litre an hour to over 2 litres an hour in some individuals. Clearly, that means different athletes need to drink different amounts before and during the event. And then, of course, if you look at electrolyte loss as well, that changes. Now, we know that athletes, as they get fitter, sweat rate goes up, but sodium retention also goes up, so we lose less electrolyte. But again, we can see a huge variance there. And so what we were able to do through our product development team was actually create bespoke products. So the sachet on the right-hand side there is a carbohydrate electrolyte powder that can be added to water. So from that, we could say to every individual athlete, this is how much you need to drink and of what concentration. And bearing in mind that 2 of the athletes in that squad are brothers, the Brownlee brothers, and they're not the top 2 blue bars. They're actually very, very different in terms of how much they sweat. If we don't measure this, if we don't seek to understand, we can't possibly give them the best level of support. Okay, my final insight or perspective is people and knowledge. We are a people industry, we're a knowledge industry. Fortunately, I haven't spent too much time in professional sport, and particularly professional football, whereby all you need to do is change the captain or the team manager and suddenly you get a massive improvement in performance. But when I talk about people, we're talking about the athletes, the coaches, and that multidisciplinary team that we put around them. Engagement's critical. More in a second. And we work really, really hard to network the knowledge and the expertise that we have. So when I was at the English Institute of Sport, we had around 250 practitioners dotted at different regional centres around the country. And what we had to do was not only just join the disciplines, but our team of 50 physiotherapists, for example, we need to make sure that every single physio benefits from the collective capability in that national network. Easier said than done, but we had some pretty good systems and processes in place to be able to do that. And in parallel to that, learning and development. Athlete performance and the impact science and medicine can have on that is only as good as the people doing it and the knowledge that they have. So in terms of engagement and motivation, I think we're incredibly lucky, and particularly in Olympic and Paralympic sport, no one's in it for the money. it's genuine passion that brings people into it. Coaches are probably the people who have it the hardest. They tend to be fairly isolated. They don't get paid particularly well. They don't really have a professional structure or discipline or body around them. And without doubt, they do the longest hours. So engagement's generally pretty high. We're surrounded by really, really motivated people. Listening to some of the talks this morning around the challenges of getting people to adhere or understand the value of stopping smoking. Now, we don't really have that in our world. We still have challenges. Not every athlete is perfect. I can guarantee you that. Some athletes do ridiculous things. Some athletes manage to fall off their bikes, blowing their nose, going downhill. It happens. Year ruined, possibly the end of his career ruined. But unfortunately, what we haven't got right is how we treat people. And anyone who follows sport and is interested in sport, you can't have missed all the headlines around bullying probably over about the last 6 years, whether it's about team selections, whether it's about athletes being left out, whether it's about coaches using overly firm tactics and behaviours with athletes, or indeed governing bodies saying, if you don't do this, you don't get that. So that's something that we need to work a lot harder on. And again, I'm extending that, not just the athletes, but the coaches and the practitioners and the support team around it. And we're learning as we go. We have a pretty ambitious goal in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Several years ago, or 22 years ago, when lottery funding came in, no one ever imagined that London would be hosting the Olympic and the Paralympic Games. No one imagined that by Beijing would be fourth in the Olympic medal table. We hoped, but didn't really imagine we'd be third come London, and we certainly couldn't conceive of being second in the Olympic medal table in Rio. So beating the Chinese with their population was phenomenal. Where we go next, I think, is going to be really difficult. But we are on a journey, and we're learning as we go. And the big push in elite sport in the UK at the moment is how can we create better environments and how can we learn more? And within those environments, how do we foster a culture of learning, of knowledge exchange, and indeed looking after the people within it? So my final thought I'll leave you with is some of the challenges that we in elite sport still face. Where to focus the resource for maximum impact? I've mentioned earlier we are fortunate, we are very well resourced, but it's still tight. Close to 1,500 athletes, every Olympic sport, every Paralympic sport needs to be funded by lottery and exchequer funding. That is only going to get tighter. Some of you who work in healthcare may well feel that so it should. More money needs to go into slightly more important areas. But of course, the total budget going to elite sport is pretty small. It can go a long way, but we have to be really efficient. So where do we focus to create the biggest impact? I've spoken a fair bit around this, making sure we look after people and performance. And if there's one reflection that many senior leaders within the British high-performance sports system would have over recent years, is we've done a phenomenal job of improving performance, getting to second place in the medal table, but has it been at an unacceptable cost? Do we need to think more carefully about how we nurture and look after the people within the system? And thirdly, redefining professional disciplines. And I mentioned this slightly tongue-in-cheek earlier. The athlete doesn't give a damn what your professional accreditation or what your discipline is. Are you going to make the boat go faster? Are you going to create benefit and impact for them? And I think in that context, we need to move out of what can at times be these professional silos and actually look very much at what our users, what the end users demand, and restructure and change our practice accordingly. So with that, thank you very much indeed.
Lee Majerison here. Thanks for listening to TopMedTalk. Now, before we let you go, it's important that we remind you to subscribe to TopMedTalk. That way you'll never, ever miss another episode. Also, if we could encourage you to join us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, pretty much every single social media platform, we're there. Join us. And finally, check out TopMedTalk.com. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to email updates. That way we can always tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and how you can join us. TopMedTalk.com, and click on the section marked email updates. Finally, TopMedTalk is proud to act as the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about them as well. EBPOM.org is their website. That's EBPOM.org. And if you go to EBPOM.org/meetings, you can find out about some of the wonderful meetings that we attend and cover across the year here on TopMedTalk. That's EBPOM.org/meetings.